Hi everyone. As Sophie said, I work for the Environment Agency and I am within the local Hampshire and Isle of Wight Fisheries, Biodiversity and Geomorphology team. To start off with, the Atlantic salmon is probably one of the best studied and culturally valuable fish that we have here in the Northern Hemisphere. Historically, it's supported commercial and recreational fisheries throughout its range, and it's a highly prized fish among anglers today. It's one of the most iconic fish that we have here on our coasts and in our rivers, and it's often referred to as the king of fish. This is given its size, its strength, and its incredible life cycle, where it spends part of its life cycle in the ocean, but also part of its life cycle in freshwater, where they breed and they lay their eggs and have their juvenile phase. Atlantic salmon are also known as a keystone species. Basically, that essentially means that it's a species critical to the overall structure and functioning of an ecosystem. And because of this, they're considered as an indicator species, or we might think of it as a canary in a coal mine, which means that the health of the species is directly affected by its ecosystem health. And so when an ecosystem is clean and well connected, its population generally thrive and are typically healthy and robust. The first question, or the first topic I'm going to cover, is the uniqueness of our chalk stream salmon. Are they unique? You know, we find them in Europe, throughout their range in Europe, North America, and the Baltics. Yet, are the salmon that we find in the chalk streams unique? And so, to answer that question, we first have to consider chalk streams themselves and what makes these particular ecosystems unique. They're a rare priority habitat. We know that there are only around 200 found worldwide, and 85% of these are found in the south and east of England, as you can see on the slide. And so chalk streams, they're very different to other rivers. They're formed upon this chalk substrate, which is porous and essentially means that our chalk streams are aquifer fed. And so this makes the rivers, the water that flows within them, this beautiful gin clear. It's also got it's more alkaline than other rivers, and we get much steadier flows and stable temperatures throughout the year. And so this sort of unique combination of factors leads to the chalk streams being sort of very special, and that this is recognised by them being designated as sites of special scientific interest and special areas of conservation. And these include both the Test and the Itchen, both have these designations and protections. When we consider salmon in chalk streams, of the 161 rivers that are classified as chalk stream, actually only a handful of them contain salmon. And so we only have a handful of significant salmon populations, and these extend from west to east. We start in the Froome, the Piddle, the Hampshire Avon, Test and Itchen, with a small population on the River Itchen. Although these chalk streams that we saw on the previous slide are located between sort of Yorkshire down in the northeast down to Dorset in the south, these rivers are in a very distinct area, separated by about 70 kilometres. And so, in answer to my previous question, are chalk stream salmon unique? The answer is yes. And they're unique in a number of ways, but one of the most crucial ways in which they are unique is their just genetic distinctiveness. And so on the screen, this is basically a plot of genetic samples taken from salmon and how related they are to one another. So you'll see the blue dots are chalk stream salmon, and they form a very, very distinct cluster compared with those from Norway, the northwest of France, and the southwest of England. And the neighbouring river to the Froome is considered a non-chalk stream, but they are more related to salmon in Norway than they are the chalk streams. And in fact, ongoing research has actually led to further sort of revelations that there is a very low level of mixing between chalk stream salmon and the non-chalk stream salmon. And the reason that for this kind of distinct genetic identity is because of the geology and the water chemistry that we find in our chalk streams. What's really important to salmon is their sense of smell. We call it olfaction, and they use it when they're out at sea. They use it to find their way home, to spawn back in their natal river. That is one way in which they are very distinct. Other ways in which they're distinct is their age. So at the height of the last ice age, about 8 to 10,000 years ago, it's thought that those chalk streams were unglaciated, so they were able to be inhabited by salmon. And when you compare this to rivers in Wales, Scotland, northeast of England, we know that those rivers were recolonised since that last sort of glacial maximum, since the last ice age. So our salmon that we have on the chalk streams are likely to be some of the most ancient. And the third and final factor that makes them unique is those conditions that we have on the chalk stream. They basically create ideal growing conditions for salmon. They're very productive, they provide ample food, and the stable temperature regime that they have for most of the year means that the growing season is longer. Non-chalk stream rivers, they generally find that the salmon, when they're young, they only spend they can spend up to 2 to 3 years in the river, whereas on the chalk streams, they typically only spend 1 year before they head out. So we're going to look at the life cycle of the salmon, because that's something that is one of the most impressive things. And so we're going to start with adults at sea and returning adults, and then we're going to focus largely on the parts of the life cycle which occur within freshwater. And we will touch again on the marine phase when we look at the common factor which is causing, unfortunately, the decline in salmon that we're seeing across their range. Once a juvenile salmon has left their natal river, they undergo extensive migrations. They swim thousands of miles to their feeding grounds in the Norwegian Sea and off the coasts of Greenland, where they feed on things like whiting, sand eel, herring, and capelin. And they will utilise different feeding grounds depending on where they originate from, so where their natal streams are, and also how long they decide to remain at sea. So they will grow and feed during their first summer, and they'll overwinter within these areas. And some salmon will decide to return to their natal streams after 1 year, and we call these one-sea winter salmon, and they're known as grilse. And we also have salmon that will decide to stay longer in the marine environment to continue feeding and attain the large size that they can with and that the marine environment supports. And these multi-sea winter fish will continue their migration into those more distant feeding grounds. So once they decide to make their return journey, they have to obviously go on a very long journey to get back to their natal streams, and they use a process called homing, which I alluded to. They use that sense of smell to find their way home. They know what their natal stream smells like, because as a juvenile they will imprint that smell, and they will essentially remember what that stream smells like. The returning adults obviously have to navigate back along our coast into our estuaries and harbours, and you could argue that Tess and Itchen salmon may have some of the most difficult journeys. And so this is largely because the Solent and Southampton water are incredibly developed. They're one of the busiest areas for boat traffic. They will then go up their respective estuaries, which have been subject to intense development, particularly around Totten, Dockhead, and on the Itchen estuary. A lot of the natural estuarine habitats that we expect to see, they're limited to things like salt marsh. So, they have to contend with all of those different factors, particularly with Southampton water being one of the sort of the largest ports in the UK. And with all of this industry and development and boat traffic comes the noise and all of the other pressures that we associate with that. And so overall, they're basically subject to a high level of disturbance and associated impacts. Once the salmon reach the estuary, we know that they hold up for several months, and this is as they basically adjust from saltwater to freshwater, and this can be quite a stressful process for them. We know that they can hold up in fairly large numbers before they then decide to move up into the river, where they will essentially hold up until they're ready to spawn. We know that they can hold up in, as I said, in these sort of large numbers around the tidal limit. So this is during a particularly low flow year. Salmon will migrate up into the river when the conditions are right, and they're largely cued by increases in discharge, which will encourage them up into the river. And so during low flows and periods of prolonged dry weather, they don't get those cues to essentially move up into those reaches. This is some footage that was taken by a colleague using a baited underwater video camera. So that they're a compilation of two different videos. Whilst they're residing within this estuarine environment, they are obviously subject to potentially periods of poor water quality, particularly during these periods of prolonged dry weather. And when we do get those periods, it can lead to delays into freshwater. Studies have also found that there can actually be a failure for salmon to enter the river when we have those low flow, prolonged dry summers. And so how do we know when salmon are coming up into our rivers? And so we understand when they're entering our rivers from our fish counters, of which we have 3 across the test in the Itchen. They are pictured on this slide. So we have 2 on the test, 1 on the greater test at Nursling, 1 on the little test at Conager, and 1 at Gators Mill on the Itchen. We use these to basically collect information on the numbers of salmon returning to each respective river. We send out monthly updates during the main migration period. And this graph essentially shows the number of salmon returning in 2023, which is the green line. You can also see the average number of counts from 2015 to 2022, and these are cumulative counts. And then we've got flow on the dashed grey line is the 10-year mean, and the blue is the 2023 flow. So these counters are located around 1 to 2 kilometres sort of upstream of the tidal limit. And as you can see, migration typically commences around May, where we find that the multi-sea winter typically arrive first. And then this is followed by a peak window of migration in July, which is typically associated with those one-sea winter fish known as growth. And thereafter, we have peak movements past the counters in October and November as those flows start to increase. The timings can differ from year to year. As you can imagine, environmental conditions aren't the same year on year, so they will be affected largely by flow. And so I've got some footage of some of the larger salmon going through our Gators Mill fish counter. So each of our fish counters is set up differently, depending on sort of the layout of the river and what is there. And so at this is Gators Mill, where we have a viewing window. This is a sort of compilation of different clips showing some large multi-sea winter fish coming through the system. So once they're in the river, they will essentially hold up until spawning, which occurs in December, January time, when temperatures are at their coolest. A female will essentially select a suitable location to create a gravel nest that we call a redd in order to lay her eggs. She'll need to find somewhere where the gravel's of the right size, the right velocity, and with cover nearby so that she can seek refuge. Female Atlantic salmon, they actively construct their redds by excavating depressions in the riverbed. And they do this by using their very powerful, they turn on their side and use their powerful tail, which essentially lifts the gravel surface and removes fine sediment. If you can see my cursor, she is here at the moment, but what you'll see is when she turns on her side and beats her tail to essentially move those gravels, which you should see in a minute. So you'll see sort of the side of her. There she is, if you can see that. And you can also see the displaced fine sediment, this plume of sediment, which you can see behind her. So I'll play that again. So here she is, and then you can see the plume of sediment travelling downstream. So once the excavation of the red is completed, the female will deposit her eggs in the depression. And it's at this point that she will be joined by males, which will be hanging around in the vicinity, where they will then release sperm to fertilize the eggs. And then once the eggs have been deposited and fertilized, the female will then cover the eggs again using the same process. So spawning is synchronized between the male and female by visual and chemical cues using pheromones. And so, as well as the adult salmon that are present, we also have within the system precocious part. So this is a really interesting part of the life cycle of Atlantic salmon. And whilst these look like juvenile salmon, they are actually sexually mature. So a proportion of the juvenile salmon will become sexually mature, and they will essentially sneak in where other males are present and attend this female when she's spawning. And so they release sperm at the same time as the larger males, and there is growing evidence that these sexually mature but sort of morphologically looking juvenile males actively participate in reproduction, and they actually contribute quite a significant proportion of the population. So in some studies in Spanish rivers have shown that they can be up to 60%. And this is the black and white picture on the right hand side shows a male salmon, or part of a male salmon, and then the precocious par waiting nearby. And so this is what essentially the structure of a red or a gravel nest looks like. It's made up of a downstream pile of clean gravel known as a tail spill and an upstream pot. And so this configuration essentially helps to ensure a good flow of water, which keeps the gravels clean and delivers well oxygenated water between the spaces in the gravel to the developing eggs, which have a high oxygen demand in order to ensure that those eggs survive, which means that they are very susceptible to things like siltation. Organic matter can essentially compete for oxygen, and that can impact on survival. And studies in the early 90s actually showed that on chalk streams in areas subject to siltation and concretion, which is like the compaction of gravels, that survival rates can be as low as 20%. Here is a picture, you can see sort of the tail spill and the pot. So it basically looks like an overturned area of clean gravel. Another photo where they are quite distinct. Once you know what you're looking for, you can identify a salmon red, where you've got these clean patches of gravel. They're around typically 1 to 3 meters wide, and they're in areas which are got a relatively fast velocity and a depth of around 0.5 meter. In other rivers, they spawn right up in the headwaters, but that's not the case on the chalk streams. They spawn relatively low down, and since 2018, we've been undertaking red counts on both the Tett and the Itchen to get an indication of how successful adults are. And this map shows their distribution for the 23-24 spawning season. The overall counts of reds this season just gone were less numerous than on other years. And whilst this will be to do with the number of returning adults that we're seeing, it's also because of the really high flows that we've had just this winter. This also means that we see them higher up the system, because it means that salmon can more easily navigate potential obstructions in the river. But it also means that the high flows can also lead to washout, where essentially the actual mounds of gravel are washed out, and we lose those reds, unfortunately. So once they've spawned, unfortunately, most Atlantic salmon die. So it's in the region of around 95%. Those that do survive may spawn again later in the year, or go out to sea and come back. But generally speaking, they die after they've spawned. And We don't tend to see large numbers of carcasses. You would expect to see more, but I think, largely they are scavenged by things like otter, and you can see the top picture there of the bite mark out of the salmon. So these are some of the photos that we've collected of these, of what we call spent salmon that have already spawned. And so these eggs, which the first life stage in the life cycle of the salmon, they're buried at a depth of around no more than 30 centimeters within the red. This means that they're protected from things like predation and light and washout, hopefully, which occurs less on the chalk streams because we have a more stable and constant flow compared with other rivers. The egg incubation period is relatively long. It's a number of months, and so after the eggs hatch, we have the alevin stage, and during this stage, they have an attached yolk sac which they feed from. In this photo, you can see the alevins, and they're about 2 centimeters long. And then following this, we have emergence from the red, and this occurs when the alevin is no longer reliant on those yolk sacs. So just to sort of demonstrate to you at what time of year this happens, we get spawning in the December, January time, and then from around then until around April, March, the eggs and alevins remain within those gravels where they are very susceptible to a number of different pressures and environmental conditions. Yeah, like I say, during this period where they're highly sensitive and they require a good supply of well oxygenated water. So the next life stage, once they've emerged from the red, we call fry. And at this life stage, they do so largely at nighttime, and that's to avoid predation. And dispersal of those fry largely occurs downstream of the red, but in still close proximity. And this is when they begin to establish feeding behaviours, which they then carry on. Establish feeding territories, which they then carry on into their next life stage, which is par. And it's this life stage fry which is a critical one, and they experience high mortality during this time. And we find that these fry typically emerge when the conditions are right, and it also depends on when the adults have spawned. And we can find that mortality increases when we have certain environmental conditions. So, for example, in 2016, we had a really bad recruitment. So basically, when I say recruitment, it's survival essentially to the next stage. That was because we had a warm winter, which potentially affected the viability of the eggs, but then we had a really cool spring. And so that meant that there wasn't the food availability around when those fry emerged, and that had a significant impact on the abundance of juvenile salmon. Par are very distinctive. They have these beautiful thumbprints along their side, along with spots. And it's during this that they have these feeding territories, and they need to grow as quickly as possible. And like we've said, the conditions in the chalk stream are ideal for the growth of par. Typically, they only take up to 1 year before they move out to sea. And so one really key thing for their growth is having the habitat to support them. And par habitat on the chalk streams is very different to those rain-fed non-chalk stream rivers. Chalk stream rivers have a low gradient, stable flow. They have much lower energy. So on rain-fed rivers, they largely seek refuge and cover from boulders and cobbles, whereas on the chalk streams, we just don't have the energy. The equivalent, I suppose you can say, is submerged weed, in-stream vegetation, and also overhanging woody debris, which provides them with refuge and cover. This in-stream vegetation is absolutely crucial. They are often associated with a submerged macrophyte known as water crowfoot. Some of you may know it as ranunculus. It's an aquatic member of the buttercup family and a key part of the ecosystem. It anchors to the riverbed, and it forms these thick canopies of trailing foliage with these fine feathery leaves, which trap silt and detritus and creates perfect conditions for invertebrates and the animals which prey on them, such as salmon. We know that the cover of ranunculus is really important in producing and supporting high numbers of salmon. An experiment was done on the Froome, another chalk stream over in Dorset, and they basically created different coverages of ranunculus. And the study found that there were more salmon at these sites, as well as sites closer to spawning and positioned lower in the river. But they also produced salmon of greater weight and larger salmon. They had higher growth rates, and that was a result of the increased biomass available as a result of the presence of ranunculus. And this bigger sort of size is really, really important for the next juvenile smolt phase, where, again, studies have shown that bigger smolts have better survival and are more likely to return as adults. We undertake PAR surveys every year to look at how successful spawning has been. We do this by undertaking specific electrofishing surveys to quantify the relative abundance of PAR. And you can see on the map the sort of key locations where we undertake these surveys, and you can see a photo of our field monitoring team undertaking those surveys. The next phase is what we call smolts. To become a smolt, a PAR has to undergo a number of changes in a process known as smoltification in order to become ready for their journey from freshwater to their feeding grounds in the sea. And it's during this period that they undergo a significant change involving modifications to their behaviour and physiology, which allow them to pre-adapt to a life in the ocean. One of the most obvious changes, which you can see from the photos, that they take on a very silvery appearance, and they become more streamlined, like many of the fish that we find in the marine environment. And so in chalk streams, we have this rapid growth with juvenile salmon leaving after a year in freshwater. But before they undertake this migration, around 25% of PAR in rivers will undergo an autumn migration to reach the lower rivers in anticipation for their migration to sea. But at this point in their life cycle, they're not actually ready to go into the marine environment. And that's been confirmed again by research on these autumn migrants. So they're not actually ready to go to sea until around mid-March. And so the smolt migration period typically is associated with increasing water temperatures and changes in river discharge. So it begins in around mid-March and it goes through to around mid-May. As they sort of travel down the river, at the start of that period, they will do so at night time to reduce predation. But as we approach later into that migration period, we find that they travel during daylight hours and typically in shoals, again, to reduce this likelihood of predation. Once they go out through the estuary, they do so very quickly, and they utilise an ebbing tide to assist their migration towards the sea. Unfortunately, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we've seen significant declines across their range. I'm going to talk through the declines that we see at sort of at a regional level around England and Wales, and then we're going to look specifically at the test in the Itchen. And so this graph has been taken from the stock assessment, which is undertaken by the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, which is known as ICES. They undertake stock assessment for commercially fished species. And this graph shows the total nominal catch of salmon caught from all habitats from 1960 to 2023. You'll note there's 4 different colours, and that's from the 4 different regions of the North Atlantic. And so, as you can see, overall, Atlantic salmon have drastically declined over the last few decades by around 70%. Just recently, in December 2023, Wildfish paid for an assessment by ICUN to determine the status of Atlantic salmon in the UK, and they were assessed as being endangered, with British salmon actually suffering additional declines from 30 to 50% since 2006, and a projected 50 to 80% decline between 2010 to 2025. What does this look like at sort of a England and Wales level? Here we can see the catches of salmon caught by rod and line anglers. The light blue represents those salmon which were caught and retained, which is historically what has happened. But from around 1993, we've seen that this practice has been changing with a change in angling practices to releasing salmon. So across this time period, we can see that levels of salmon caught fluctuate, but levels unfortunately start to largely decline after 1990. And we have to remember that from 1993, a proportion or an increasing proportion were being returned. And so we can see from probably around 2010 that we have a significant decline in salmon, despite these salmon being returned. In England and Wales, we have in total 64 what we call principal salmon rivers. The stock is assessed each year against the probability of it meeting a management objective. And we categorise each of these principal salmon rivers into 4 different categories, depending on whether they're likely to meet or the probability of them meeting this objective. So we start with at risk, where then, not likely to meet their objective, to not at risk, where they are obviously much more likely to. And unfortunately, you can see that an overwhelming number of our principal salmon rivers in England and Wales are red. For England, it represented 71% of salmon in 2022, and in Wales it was 95%. And so these figures are taken from the 2022 stock assessment, because the latest stock assessment for 2023 hasn't yet been released. Unfortunately, from looking at the preliminary data, the number of salmon rivers or principal salmon rivers at risk has increased since 2022. When we look at the test and Itchen populations, we can see actually from this graph, and I have to highlight that the timescales over which we're looking at these changes in salmon is from 1990, and this is because this graph is displaying the number of returning adults to the test and Itchen counted via our fish counters. And so our fish counters started counting in 1990. And so blue bars represent the test and the grey bars represent the Itchen. And you also see 2 dotted lines which represent the conservation limit for each river. And so the conservation limit is essentially a minimum level required to maintain the population at a biologically safe level. And when it drops below this line, the probability of further decline becomes increasingly likely. As you can see from this graph, both rivers have actually struggled to reach their conservation limit, particularly in the 1990s. This is in part due to the practice of retaining those fish that were caught. Obviously, like we explored previously, changes began in around 1993, and actually on the chalk streams from around 2002, we had 100% adoption of voluntary catch and release. And so you can see from around then or thereafter that actually the number of salmon slowly start to increase up until around 2015, where we start to see a decline. Now, the exception to that, and you will say, I'm not seeing decline, I'm seeing this massive blue bar, and this massive blue bar, and to some extent a bigger bar for the Itchen in grey, occurred in 2020. And as you probably all remember or don't want to remember, this was the COVID year. The number of returning adults during this year were much higher. We had this exceptional year, and this is thought to be in part due to the relaxation of a number of pressures of Atlantic salmon, combined with good environmental conditions such as high flows. So when we delve into this recent decline a little deeper, we have a look at the latest statistics for 2022, which don't unfortunately paint a pretty picture. So in 2022, the returning stock estimate for the test was around 506 fish. This is around 50% of that conservation limit, so that minimum stock target, and that was the 4th lowest since those records began in 1990. On the Itchen, unfortunately, it was even bleaker. We only had 133 fish, and which represented around only 20% of that conservation limit, and it was actually the lowest number of fish that we've seen. And so before I delve into what we're doing to help tackle the declines, particularly on the Itchen, I want to talk you through some of the pressures, why we're seeing these overall declines across the North Atlantic. To do this, I have to talk to you about the marine phase and marine survival. This is a common factor amongst all of, the North Atlantic population. They all go to sea. It's these pressures within the marine environment and a reduction in marine survival, which you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, that marine survival has more than halved since the 1980s, with a marked drop around 1990. And with recent monitoring estimates actually showing that sea survival is around 3%. And ultimately, it's to do with the marine conditions which salmon are being subjected to. The marine environment's undergone significant changes as a result of climate change, which has led to a general warming in the North Atlantic. We see this also expressed in the increase in intensity and frequency of marine heat waves, and this is the bottom map where you can see where these latest marine heat waves are occurring, and you can actually see here in the North Atlantic, as recently as June 2023, we experienced one of the longest marine heat waves. And so what does this mean? Well, essentially, it leads to large-scale changes in our oceanographic processes and currents, and creates a northward shift in many species, including those prey species which salmon feed on, meaning that salmon have to actually migrate even further. And those changes in prey availability have been shown through changes in what we call zooplankton energy. So zooplankton are small crustaceans, key part of the food chain, which are fed on by the species upon which salmon feed. So fish larvae on which salmon feed on these zooplankton. And a recent study has linked this decline in zooplankton energy to the decline in marine survival. And you can see, basically what you need to be looking at is, you can see a large amount of blue, and on the scale, you've got a negative change occurring. This zooplankton is an essential prey item, and the two have been linked and implicated in the marine mortality of a large number of salmon at sea, unfortunately. And so the other impact that we're also seeing from climate change, which is related to marine survival, is these impacts of climate change on the freshwater and estuarine environment, which we have alluded to. Obviously, these environmental conditions are very important in the sort of the size and the growth rates of the parr and the smolts that we have within the freshwater system. And if those conditions aren't right, then they essentially lead to smaller individuals, which have been shown to have poor survival. And so whilst our governments are making change or are taking steps to halt this warming and addressing climate change, we also require action within that freshwater environment and estuarine environment to ensure that we are producing salmon which are as good a condition to essentially combat some of those pressures that they are seeing in the marine environment. So this leads me on to some of the pressures that we're able to influence, perhaps more than in the marine environment, which is largely outside of our control. And these range from they're very wide ranging, and they are often interlinked and have cumulative impacts on the various life stages of salmon that we've explored throughout this presentation. So they range from anything from pollution from sewage to diffuse pollution from sources such as agricultural runoff, which we know smother or have the potential to smother reds and lead to lower survivability of eggs. We have low flows, which can caused by over-abstraction and climate change, which impacts on those salmon returning, also leading to increasing temperatures and impacting on this water quality that we're seeing in estuaries and also within the freshwater environment. And so it's these ones that I've highlighted in bold that the Itchen Salmon Delivery Plan is looking to tackle where it can. Because of the significant declines that we've seen on the Itchen, we responded to this by developing the Itchen Salmon Delivery Plan. It was developed in early 2023 in collaboration with external stakeholders, and we began implementing them shortly after. And the plan essentially contains urgent and targeted action that we hope to deliver in the short to medium term to help support recovery and rebuilding of the populations. So the purpose of this document is to basically outline and prioritise these specific and achievable actions. And we're supported by a working group. Like I said, we did this in collaboration. We have a working group which is made up of a range of external stakeholders, including the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, who are obviously facilitating this talk today, Wildfish, Wessex Rivers Trust, the Wild Trout Trust, Test and Itchen Association, the Angling Trust, the Itchen Navigation Preservation Society, and I'm sure that there's more that I haven't covered. So one of the first things, and I've mentioned this throughout the talk, is estuarine water quality and how important it is. Estuarine water quality is recognised as one of the key pressures on fish returning to the Test and Itchen estuaries. We collect data on sort of water quality, and that feeds into our responsibilities under the Water Framework Directive. But in recent years, we've actually been able to look at the water quality in these areas, specifically in sort of the upper estuary, as a result of using different instrumentation to monitor water quality, where we basically install sondes which report back in real time, and they are consistently monitoring that water quality at a very sort of high resolution of reporting back between every 5 and 15 minutes. These sondes first went in on the test, and we found that, during those sort of warm summers that we've had over the last couple of years, particularly in 2021 and 2022, it highlighted periods of really poor water quality at key points over sort of a daily, but also a spring neat tidal cycle. I'm talking about low dissolved oxygen and high temperatures reaching thresholds potentially lethal to salmon. And so this prompted us to install sondes on the Itchen estuary, where we have additional concerns that water quality may be impounded by the discharge of relatively poor quality treated effluent from the Portswood sewage treatment works, which is located right at the top of the Itchen estuary. Basically, we started water quality monitoring in 2023, so we started sort of, I think it was around May, June time. And so we looked at that water quality data over the summer of 2023, and we analysed that. And we found, in fact, that the water quality was, in fact, quite a bit worse on the Itchen than the test. And so we summarised these findings in a report in February 2024, and we shared it with the working group and other stakeholders, obviously including Southern Waters as operators of the sewage treatment works. Since then, Southern Water they've significantly invested in carrying out emergency works to improve the quality of their treated effluent. And we hope to see the results of those emergency works. They may have even started now, but we're hoping to see those very shortly, if not already. In addition to these sort of emergency works, they also have further works, further long-term improvements, which have been submitted as part of their business planning cycle, and these are aimed to be delivered by 2030, which are associated with sort of and subject to approval by Ofwat. In addition to estuarine water quality, we've also been looking at obstructions to migration, and so we're working on improving migration at structures which we know to be particularly challenging. This photo is taken at one structure in particular where we are looking at making it more passable, and so we're currently having a design done by a contractor, and we will aim to install in 2025. We're also looking at a lower Itchen restoration strategy from around Mansbridge down to Woodmill, a key part of which will focus on fish passage, which is a key part of the salmon migration route into the Itchen. In addition to this, we've also been carrying out habitat enhancements and gravel cleaning in combination with one another. We've been doing this in collaboration with the Wild Trout Trust. These works are done at a very localized red scale, sort of in areas sort of 20 by 20 meters. Gravel cleaning isn't sustainable on its own. You would have to do it sort of year on year, which is not a particularly sort of sustainable option. And so what we've been doing is we've been gravel cleaning in combination with habitat enhancements, which essentially look to increase velocities, increase the ability of the river to essentially clean those gravels, and that helps to improve survivability of eggs. But also the woody material provides cover for par and cover for adults, and a place of refuge. We've also been working on diffuse pollution. We've been looking at drone footage, which was captured in 2022, and we've been working with our agricultural team. As well as the drone footage, we've been working on reports from people. So you can see some of the photos taken here of fields laid bare in winter. And, these can be a key problem with fine sediments running during periods of high rainfall into our rivers. And you can see the result on the left-hand side, and where they settle out, they have the potential to smother reds. We've also been looking at anthropogenic disturbance. We are seeing obviously a lot more recreational use of our riverine environment by wild swimmers, by anglers, and walkers, as well as other sort of water sports. And this, quite rightly, was because of COVID-19 led many of us to engage with our local environment. And whilst this is obviously a definite positive thing on mental health, but also raising awareness of the issues surrounding our rivers, it's also led to this increased traffic and potential for anthropogenic disturbance. As we know, salmon are present all year round in our rivers, with critical period, the really sensitive period, being between December and May, where we need to look at how we manage these activities to ensure that they're having the least risk possible, which links to sort of some of the positive education that we've been doing. We've been running catch and release sessions for anglers. We've created pamphlets for wild swimmers to essentially advise on times of year that they should be avoiding, and other things that they can be doing to reduce those risks to salmon. One of the really most important things that you can do is, when you're walking along the river and you're enjoying the Itchen, is if you see anything, if you see a change in water quality, so you're seeing inputs into the river, you're smelling a potential sewage, any suspected pollution event, please phone it in. If you're clued up on potential illegal fishing, again, that's another thing that we really want to hear from people. It really helps us to build a picture of where these events are occurring. So that's one of the key things that you can do. In addition to this, again, it's positive education. So, you may be a wild swimmer, you may be an angler. If you are, then we encourage you to proactively seek advice and guidance to minimize your risks to salmon. And we encourage you to then educate those people around you that are also carrying out the same activity. You can also get involved. There are a number of different organisations, which I've written here on the screen, and more, where you can get involved with improving your local riverine environment. Being responsible, that's wide-ranging actions that you can do to minimise your impacts on chalk streams. Our water companies are continuing to try to get us to use less water, and that's because they abstract from the chalk streams for public supply. So if you can use less, then that pressure becomes reduced. Also looking at what goes down your drains, maintaining your septic tanks, minimizing your dog going in and out of the river, creating bank erosion and sort of those fine sediments. But also something that not all dog owners are aware of is the flea treatments that are used. So flea treatments actually contain an insecticide to kill ticks and fleas, of what they're intended to do. But they can also include insects and invertebrate life, and those impacts can last up to 90 days following treatment. So, if you've got a dog, if you've given it flea treatment, ideally they would not be going into the river, because it can impact on the invertebrate life. And finally, it's spreading the word. I've come to talk to you today to raise awareness about the plight of salmon. You can do the same. We briefly mentioned earlier this increased awareness about the issues threatening our rivers, because more people are using them. So make sure that you're including the plight of salmon in those conversations. And after all, like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, they're the canary in the coal mine for our chalk streams. You know, they're the indicator of our chalk stream health. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.